lecture Interpreting Significant Texts, and it is in conjunction with the Medhurst reading. Very quickly about the author before I get into text and purpose of interpretation. Martin Medhurst is a distinguished professor of rhetoric, distinguished meaning like highest in rank that a professor could be in political science at Baylor, and is an expert on presidential rhetoric and political communication. So even the fact that he's positioned in a political science department shows sort of how rhetoric has these outward impacts, and how rhetoric is, rhetorical criticism is really interdisciplinary in nature, because rhetorical criticism looks at significant texts, including, for example, political texts. So Martin Medhurst is someone who specializes in political communication and looking at political texts as rhetoric. So his work has been quoted by a lot of mainstream news sources, like his expertise on rhetoric and political campaigns. He has been interviewed by CBS Morning News for like Trump campaign and commentary, and he's also been interviewed by like Dallas Morning News, CSM, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times, or interviewed or quoted. He's also the founding editor for the journal Rhetoric and Public Affairs, and the book series for Rhetoric and Public Affairs, which is actually based out of Michigan State in East Lansing. And he's authored or edited 13 books, most of them related to political communication, and I've listed some of them. He specialized a lot in Cold War rhetoric, and particularly the rhetoric of Eisenhower, but generally speech writing and speech campaigns are his primary interests. But as you all saw from even the essay, which went through 5 different pieces of rhetorical criticism that he's done, that he is a rhetorical critic that doesn't only study one type of artifact. So we can think of rhetorical criticism as a form of textual interpretation. And I put the quote from the very top of the article: "The critic is right to think that the text should speak to us. The point which needs to be grasped clearly by the critic is that a text cannot be made to speak to us until what it says has been understood." And so that's why I put this little relative figure here, that the text speaks to you as the interpreter, but you as the interpreter are also speaking to and about the text, like to other people about the text. So it's a mutual relationship of the text having meaning that is being communicated to you, but also you communicating the meaning of the text to others. So the role of rhetorical criticism is to help your audience, the people who would be reading your rhetorical criticism, better understand what is going on in a complex rhetorical situation or a complex situation of human communication. All right, so the first 2 questions that a rhetorical critic must ask, according to Martin Medhurst, is what should I study, i.e., what should my text be? And as last week's lecture sort of got deeper into, what artifacts should be the sort of representative samples of my text? And why should I study it? So these are questions of text and purpose. Your purpose is your motivation or the goal that you have when you're conducting this critical analysis. So like, what's the point of doing the rhetorical criticism? And for a paper isn't enough. Like, for a grade isn't enough of a reason. There has to be a reason, even if your primary motivation is doing it for this class. There's there's meaningful criticism that you can do even if you feel like you're being forced into doing the rhetorical criticism. So you still should have a motivation or a goal for conducting your critical analysis, or else, first of all, you're going to get bored, but also your audience is going to get bored. Because why study something if it doesn't matter to you? And why study something if it doesn't matter to anyone else? Like, if it doesn't have a broader significance, then nobody needs to hear about your interpretation. So Medhurst says that there's sort of two standards that you should use when selecting a thing to write about as a rhetorical critic, like investing in the whole 4 to 6 step process we talked about, which takes time and energy. What types of texts are worth your time and energy to invest in? And according to Medhurst, you should invest in writing about something that matters both to society and to you personally as the critic. So the reason that I chose this essay is because I like that someone who's been experienced in the field of rhetorical criticism sort of used a narrative form and explained why the purpose behind why he did all of the 5 rhetorical criticisms that he went through. He explained, you know, the purpose behind them, the method he used, and then a brief synopsis of what he found. And so there were different purposes that he had in conducting each of those rhetorical criticisms. But what was the sort of constant is that there was a significant reason for him to study those. Like, he thought it had a significance in society, and also there was something that sparked his interest about continuing to do the rhetorical criticism. So if the text is significant, then you can produce a significant interpretation of the text that points to the text's significance. But if you have an insignificant text, your interpretation is likely to be insignificant as well. Like, if it was already insignificant in the first place as a piece of rhetoric, then why write about it as a piece of rhetoric? Like, why interpret it? And don't conflate significant with popularity. So a piece of rhetoric could be relatively unknown or unpopular, but you could still argue that it has a significance or believe that it has a significance. So choose your text with a purpose in mind. Have that, as Medhurst says, that aha moment that's like, this is the text that I want to analyze. And this could be, because how I was saying, the rhetorical world is your oyster, and we are all so like tuned in to mediated communication these days. It could be something on your social media stream, it could be an advertisement, it could be a YouTube video, it could be a speech you heard on the radio or one of the presidential debates. Like, something that just sparks your interest could be what leads you down the path to doing a rhetorical criticism. So some sample purposes that I came up with, and there's a lot of different sample purposes, and they range from, I have a hunch about, you know, what's going on here with this rhetoric, to I have no idea what's going on, but it really sparks my interest. And in the middle being like, oh, I think I kind of know what's going on, but it would help if I did some more studying of it. So at the top, we have like, to demonstrate how Trump's speeches influence the public's opinion and action. So everyone has some sort of opinion on Trump's speeches. Like, some of us care more than others. But if you already have a hunch about how Trump's speech is influencing public opinion, like, let's say you had a theory that Trump's speeches increase the political divisiveness of the country. That's something that you might have a hunch about. And so the purpose of your analysis is to demonstrate that hunch, and that's sort of what that sparks your initial impulse. Or to argue that a new genre of TV is emerging. So maybe you're watching a TV show and you're saying, this doesn't really fit classically within the horror genre, but it also doesn't fit within the true crime genre. Maybe there's this genre emerging that's like in between true crime and horror. And so I'm going to argue that there's a new genre of TV emerging. And that might have been sparked by just like my Netflix like binge watching. Just maybe to disprove a common misconception about an artifact. So let's say you're hearing someone talk about something all the time. Like you're hearing people talk about the the governor's mask uh, order, and you hear a common misconception about the governor's rhetoric, and you want to correct that misconception, right? So maybe it's like rhetorical criticism can be a form of myth busting, where you're like, there's this myth about these artifacts, and I have some idea that there might be a different interpretation going on here. Or maybe not that there's like that the interpretations that are out there are wrong, but that they're oversimplified. And so maybe you have an interpretation that complicates the audience understanding of an artifact. So let's say that a TV show has like one common understanding of what the ending meaning means, like the last scene of The Sopranos or something. Like there's a lot of different interpretations about what the last scene meant, but what if you read through them and decided like there's another level of complexity, or there's another interpretation out there that needs to be offered in order to come to a full understanding about what the meaning of the end of this TV series was. Or to learn how a trend in the media influences the audience's conceptions of self-esteem. So this is more going on the, okay, I have some ideas, I'm interested in this, but I don't really know that much about it, so that's gonna be sort of the spark. Like, I have a feeling that there's a connection between the way that the media portrays, for example, body image, and the average person's conception of self-esteem, of their own self-esteem based on, comparing themselves to media images. Or to understand how an advertisement campaign was so effective despite it being so obviously misleading. So now we're in the area of, I'm curious, but I don't really know. Like, this is a curiosity to me, that even though it's so obvious that this campaign is misleading, that people are still buying into it. And so that might be the starting point or the purpose of your analysis. And then a specific example of that might be that you want to draw a conclusion about why people are buying these products off of Instagram endorsers who clearly don't use those products. So like the Kim Kardashian and the other Kardashians selling like certain like teas, fitness teas, and saying that that's what makes them skinny, even though everybody knows that they have a lot of plastic surgery, and that they use a lot of products to make them skinny, not just one tea. So why do people still buy those teas, even though they know that that's not the product that the endorser is using? Like, that might confuse you and be like, I want to look more into this rhetorical situation and figure it out. Or even to figure out, like, why is everyone so obsessed with the Kardashians? Like, seems to be a sort of constant in our culture, in American culture. There's definitely stuff written about in cultural studies in our field, but maybe that's just something that's on your mind, and you're like, it's part of your everyday that you're being bombarded with these messages. So you're trying to wonder why, like, why is everyone so obsessed with this? So these are just some examples of things that might spark your interest, and obviously that the options are infinite, and so it's personal to you what will be sparking your interest. But regardless of what type of, like, what arena you're interested in looking at, like if you're interested in looking at politics like Medhurst, that's great. Or if you're interested in looking at film, or if you're interested in looking at digital and new media, because rhetoric is an art, it's an art form, but rhetoric is a practical and productive art. It's not a fine art. And so whatever the artifact that you look at, it might not be like a political artifact, but it's like political or socio-political in the sense that rhetoric comes into existence because it's communication with intended meaning. It comes into existence to affect something beyond itself. And so you need to be interested in the artifact for what it is doing outwardly, rather than just being interested in the artifact because it's interesting just as an internal artifact. So a really nice painting, you wouldn't say this painting is great. Um, that's investigating the text, but not really looking at the impact of the text. So you can't just stop at this movie, this one being Citizen Kane, like this movie was the best movie. Like if you're not looking at the impact of the movie, then you're not really doing rhetorical criticism. Because if a movie is rhetoric, it's rhetoric because it has a communicative message, and it is attempting to communicate something to the audience, influence the audience. And so part of what interests you has to not only be the text, but the interaction between the text and the world. So like what the text is doing, what the text is producing, what the impact and the consequences of the text are. So it should, when looking for texts, you should keep that in mind, that it should be something that interests you because of its outward impact, not just something that interests you like sort of in a vacuum. So the first step to doing the textual interpretation, to interpreting a text, like is understanding the nature of the text. So like when you interpret a text, when you find your artifacts and you start to analyze them, like when you're moving on to step 2 and you're starting to analyze them and you're making your observations, you're gonna observe the 4 basic components of any rhetorical interaction, which is there's always somebody who created the message or the rhetor, a message, the message itself, or the text, whether that be oral, written, or sometimes a written copy of what was originally given orally. A receiver, or the audience, the person that is intended to or does receive the message, and then a broader context in which that interaction of sending the message from one to the other, there's a broader context that shapes that interaction and makes it possible. So understanding a thing, understanding an artifact, just how I gave the analysis of, its weight, its date, its age, its density, that kind of stuff. The basic components of a speech act or a piece of rhetoric are, who did it, what was it, who received it, and what was the broader context in which. And then getting deeper, which all of the rest of this is summarized from page 4. You also want to ask these questions about your rhetoric. First of all, genre, what kind of rhetoric is it? So that could be like, is it a TV show? But more specifically, like what genre of TV show does it fit into? Or, what genre of political rhetoric, even like, is this campaign rhetoric, or is this a State of the Union address, or is this a public debate, or is this an advert? I guess an advertisement would be campaign, but you could even say like campaign advertisement versus campaign speech. Motive, what was the purpose for which the rhetoric was created? And sometimes the motive isn't just right there for you. Like sometimes the motive also requires interpretation. It requires you to figure out what was going on. Like in a film, for example, if everyone just was really honest about their motives all the time, it wouldn't make for a good or suspenseful film. Like part of how film keeps you guessing is by having the character's motivations be something that you have to guess about. So for what purpose was the rhetoric created? Like State of the Union, obviously the motive, there's a general motive, which is like to deliver the State of the Union. But then you could say in your interpretation, the main thing that the president was trying to get out of this particular State of the Union, given the context of what was happening at this particular time, was probably to change the audience's opinion about X. So the audience, you want to analyze for whom the message was intended, but also this could mean analyzing for whom the audience actually was. So maybe a speaker gave a speech for an intended audience, but then didn't realize that that was going to go viral on social media. And so then the nature of the message going viral does something to the rhetorical and, situation of the rhetorical act here, because the audience ends up being much bigger than intended. The internal form is basically the strategies and techniques that make up the rhetoric. So if you were looking at like the internal form of a painting, it would be like what strokes were used, what colors were used, what material was used. The internal form of rhetoric was sort of how is it organized? What were the main points? How was it delivered? Were there metaphors used? There's a lot of factors that go into internal form. This is where a lot of your observations that are sort of unique to, like how I was talking about writing your different observations down on different sticky notes. A lot of those will be about the internal form. Audience adaptation. How does the author or the rhetor seem to try to adapt to the audience? So this is again why context matters, because it's like if the president is trying to influence public opinion at a particular moment of time, well, the audience might already feel a particular way about it, or he might be trying to overcome a particular audience conception about, let's say, the economy. So what strategies did he use to specifically adapt to that conception about the economy? Another thing is execution. How well did the rhetor utilize rhetoric? So like, how good was the rhetor at doing the rhetoric? Like, if a rhetor is eloquent, then they did really well at utilizing the rhetoric. It means that they were persuasive and they had a very artistic, stylized and rehearsed way of speaking. If the execution was shoddy and the rhetoric, the author didn't use rhetoric well, you could still, it's not just to like grade the piece of rhetoric, but how well the rhetor utilized rhetoric could be significant, because the same message delivered from somebody who's delivering it well versus delivering it not well, as you all learn from public speaking, the message could get lost if the rhetor isn't using the proper strategies or techniques in order to communicate the message. And then finally, the uniqueness of the text. How is this rhetoric like or unlike others of its type? So is this a unique piece of rhetoric? Is this a unique public address to the people? Does it shatter stereotypes or common patterns amongst other types of rhetoric in its genre? Or does it pretty much conform to the standards or the expectations of what you would think? And of course, these are the general questions, but because every work of rhetoric, like every text that you might be looking at is unique, every critical analysis also requires you to address the things that are unique. So when you're going and writing your observations on sticky notes or on, digitally, if you think that something seems important, write it down, regardless of if you can't figure out where it goes in this like format. Write it down, because if you think it's important, it's probably important. And so address issues that are specific and unique to that. And I'll get to this later, but you're letting the text guide your observations. You're not starting with assumptions and then like not like sort of excluding certain observations that you make because they don't conform with your preconceived notions. You want to let the text sort of guide you. And so write down observations that seem significant. And the next step after doing that analysis, that basic analysis of the components of your text and sort of breaking down the different component parts, is doing a close reading of the text. And, Medhurst emphasized that in his belief, and this is the way, he practiced what he preached, all good rhetorical criticism starts with the text or text under examination. And then your theory or method of examining those texts should grow out of your close reading. So I know that in the last lecture I said, keep your method in mind when you're reading your text, but you don't want to let your method over determine what your texts are. So you want to focus on doing this close reading, and in the process of doing that close reading, you may decide to change what your initial impulse for what your method was. So let's say you wanted to do an ideology criticism and you wanted to look at like class and how it's operating in a particular speech. And then as you start doing your close reading, you actually start to realize that there's more interesting dynamics at play in doing an analysis of gender. And so you decide to switch your method from like ideology criticism to feminist criticism. That means that's a good sign if you're changing your method based on the text, because you don't want just the text to, if you already knew what the answer was ahead of doing this process completely, then there wouldn't really be a point to do a close reading, because doing the close reading is like sparked by your purpose, by your like wondering I need to figure out more what's going on here. So when you're actually engaged in the analysis process, which is like step two of the 4-step process, when you're engaged in this analysis and you're doing this close reading, then your theory and your method of examining the text will adapt and could potentially change based on doing that close reading. So the theory or method of examining those texts will grow out of your close reading, and your close reading is part of your research, like sitting with the text and reading them. Even in his example of going to the Eisenhower archives, he did all of this additional archival research to find notes about the speech and internal memos about the speech and rough drafts of the speech. But he said the thing that he did the most was read the text over and over and over again. So doing that close reading is the most important part, but you also need to combine that, since every text is, in relation to a context. Like every text, every rhetorical interaction is made possible by and shaped by the context in which it arises. And so understanding and doing your close reading, combining that with a historical understanding of the situation or the context that called that rhetoric into existence in the first place. So in order to understand rhetoric and its outward effect, we have to look outward at the situations that created that rhetoric and the situations that sort of made that rhetoric possible and made that audience come into contact with that rhetor, for example, in the first place. And so doing your close reading, you should not be, for example, coming across an observation and saying, oh, but that doesn't fit in within what my theory was going into this, and so I'm going to exclude it. Your close reading, you might dig up some stuff that you didn't expect to uncover. So the private eye, having this like cliche sort of icon of a private eye that has a magnifying glass that allows them to see more, and you know, even the field of private investigation, people pay a private investigator to do some investigation and discovery with a hunch that something is going on, but then the private investigator might, like, maybe the private investigator finds out and confirms your hunch, but maybe the private investigator finds out something that has a lot more layers and goes deeper, or something completely that you didn't expect. So I like this metaphor of rhetorical critics being like detectives, and that discovery and investigation are a part of the process of sitting with the text and analyzing them, rather than just thinking of yourself as like a processor of texts, where it's like, okay, we have this code, we have this method, we have these texts, and now our purpose is just to fit them like neatly within the puzzle. If you were a private investigator, like, you might start with the initial theory that the person who hired you, like, okay, I have a theory that this person's having an affair. You might start with that theory, but if the evidence starts to lead in a different direction, you're going to start to follow that other direction, instead of just saying, well, it doesn't fit in my theory, and so I'm going to ignore all this other evidence that there's something else going on. So the process of doing rhetorical criticism is a process of discovery. And to continue with the analogy, Medhurst says, a good detective never presumes to know what the answer to the case is before conducting the investigation. He lets the evidence lead him to his conclusions. And so this is sort of what I was just saying, like, there might be skeletons in the closet, and those skeletons might be different than the skeletons that you thought were in the closet. So let the process lead you to those conclusions, and don't let the ideological sort of blinders of a particular like method or theory that you had in mind before constrain your seeing the real evidence of what's going on in this case. So remember when I had put the purpose of sort of having a hunch or a confusion or curiosity about what's going on here. If you have a hunch about it, your hunch could have been wrong. And it's still interesting that you know, and a good sign that you changed your mind about and now at the end of your investigation, you have a different interpretation about what's going on here with the rhetoric. Now, because you've done this investigation and because you've considered an initial theory and ruled it out, and now you've presented another theory, you have justification for that theory. So your process of investigating is allowing you to build your case, like how we were talking about artifacts or your data. It allows you to build enough data points that you can like build a case and say, okay, now I have this interpretation of what's going on here. And investigation can produce unexpected discoveries. So that's why in the last lecture I had said, it's not just about what you want to get out of your artifacts, but it's about what you do or what you can get out of your artifacts in the process of analysis. Because like Medhurst said, he went into looking at one of, I think, Bush's presidential speech, looking at it just for the content, it being about balance, but then he started looking at the form, and the form was balanced too. So it was like, that was an unexpected discovery. or I won't go on about that, but there's, you know, there's unexpected discoveries, and coming to a conclusion or interpretation that you didn't think you would is a good sign, not a bad sign. And then at the end of this process, which, you know, Medhurst and Foss, now they both agree that and have demonstrated how rhetorical criticism, it is a process. The writing part of it is the end. The writing part of it is concluding your findings, and you have to do this. You have to have you have to have something that sparks your interest. You have to pick a text. You have to have a purpose for doing rhetorical criticism. You have to analyze and interpret your artifacts, and then at the end of that process of investigation and discovery, you present your case to, like, if you were a private investigator, you would wait until you have all your evidence in line, and you could present it in a clear way that demonstrates your interpretation. That's the process of writing the rhetorical criticism. And at the end, you make an argument. You make an interpretation is an argument. So at the heart of all rhetorical criticism is good argument. Your interpretation of a text is an argument. So interpretation, the word alone, like if the text wasn't up for interpretation, then if it was just like a yes no question, like did this rhetoric happen, or you know, is this TV show rated R, or, you know, is this movie rated R or rated PG-13? That's not really an interpretation. That's just a yes no question. Like, it's either rated R or it's rated PG-13. It's either available on Netflix or it's not available on Netflix. That's not like an interpretation. That's just a statement of fact. But if you're interpreting the text and you're making an original interpretation of the text, then it requires argument, because you can't just say an interpretation and not have reasons for it. There has to be a justification. So the act of interpretation requires you to propose a theory or like a thesis statement for your interpretation, and then give reasons or explanations for why you believe in that interpretation, for why you, you know, what's the justification, what's the legitimacy behind your interpretation. So if you thought that your significant other was having an affair and the private detective came to you and said, no, they're not having an affair, but they have a secret charity organization on the side, and then they have no evidence of that, you'd be like, you're not a very good private detective. This interpretation kind of came out of thin air, and why would I pay for that interpretation? Or if you said, oh, my interpretation is that I'm just validating your interpretation, they're cheating, and then you're like, where's your evidence? And they're like, it was just obvious, it was the same thing you said. It's like, well, that's not what I paid you for, because I didn't pay you to just repeat my hunch back to me. I paid you to create an interpretation and justify it. So same thing with rhetorical criticism. You have to have explanations and justifications behind your interpretation, or else people are going to be like, that's just an interpretation. There's nothing to hold it up. And then Medhurst had said that critique fails when it either doesn't establish a propositional argument at all, so like there's no interpretation forwarded, or when it does have an argument, but that argument isn't significant. So that's what he's talking about with the so what question. And that's why you have to have a purpose in mind when you look at your text, because again, if the text is not significant, your argument isn't going to be significant. And sometimes even if the text is significant, your argument still could not be significant. So you need to make an argument that people are going to say, like, not only realize that the text matters, like, oh, now because of your interpretation, I realize the text matters, but it's like, what is the so what behind why should I care about this argument? And I'll refer back to step 3 of Foss's method, which is like having a research question. Having a research question gets to the significance or the so what of behind your argument. So your argument, again, is like an answer to your general research question. And so the following would be like, could be arguments that would not be considered rhetorical criticism. So like just summarizing an artifact, for example, like a book review where there's not really an attempt to get into the artifact and really explain what it's doing. It's just summarizing what the book is so that people sort of know what it is, can buy it. That's not rhetorical criticism. Like creating a basically summary of what an artifact is for Sparks Notes or for an Amazon review or something, just summarizing an artifact, that's not rhetorical criticism. That's just rhetorical summary. Summarizing another person's interpretation of an artifact. So if you were to try to short circuit in this class and not sit with your text and not do a close reading and not analyze them, like let's say you chose a text that's just like commonly written about, like Friends, and then you wanted to make an argument that like Friends has messages that are, I don't know, like let's say you want to say Friends has messages that are problematically I don't know. Basically, it doesn't matter what it doesn't matter what your thesis about Friends. I can't think of it on the spot. But let's say, okay, actually, I'll give a good example. Let's say I want to say like that Friends has problematic representations of relationships. And so obviously a big component of Friends is relationships. And so I just go on Google and I search Friends and, the rhetoric and relationships. And then or problematic relationships or problematic representations in Friends. I just start Googling for interpretations of Friends. So if you're just summarizing other people's interpretations of an artifact, that is just a literature review of interpretations. That is not doing original work, creating an original interpretation. That is summarizing other people's interpretations of an artifact, and that's not rhetorical criticism. And then the third thing would be just evaluating just the internal art form of an artifact. So like we were talking about how graffiti could be rhetoric, and you could look at the way that graffiti like communicated messages to audiences. Well, if you just looked at graffiti and said, this graffiti is the best piece of graffiti that I've found in Detroit, because the artist just did such a good job with, constructing the form of the graffiti, and then the color was good, and the location that they chose was like perfect to do this graffiti, but not because of like the message or what it's doing to the audience, but just because it was great graffiti. That is like art criticism, but it's not rhetorical criticism, because you're looking at it just as a piece of art, like fine art. You're not looking at it as a piece of rhetorical art. So like art criticism could be evaluating the internal form of an artifact, but that's not rhetorical criticism. And then just as a sort of footnote to this, that of course, when you're doing rhetorical criticism, summarizing your artifact is going to be part of it. And summarizing other people's interpretations of the artifact could also be part of it. Like, as long as you're giving credit where credit is due, it's fine to incorporate and be in conversation with other people's interpretations of artifacts. But if you are not doing any of your own original interpretation of the text and you're just summarizing, that's like just doing a lit review. And that does not on its own constitute rhetorical criticism. So in any of these three things, or all of these three things, could be components of the rhetorical criticism, and should be, like 1 and 3, especially summarizing the artifact and evaluating its form. But if that was the main purpose, was just doing one of those things, that wouldn't be criticism. So the process, again, of Medhurst doesn't exactly follow the, you know, four to six step process that Foss outlines, but the way that he describes the process of rhetorical criticism is consistent with Foss's mechanism and, or, you know, or method. And his explanation of his process of doing rhetorical criticism and just the general process of doing rhetorical criticism echoes the importance of thinking of rhetorical criticism as a process that takes time and comes in multiple steps. So in his narrative, it's like to inquire about something because it sort of sparks your interest, to dig in and do the discovery, to create a theory, and you know, in the process of discovery, you might create a theory and then discover more and then create another theory and then discover more and create another theory, just like an investigator. So the process of discovery and theorization could be this process of back and forth. And then finally, when you go to write, you're arguing. So I think on page 9, he summarizes the way that this process sort of organically happens if you're a rhetorical critic. The critic, you first discover the issue or question that lies at the heart of your text under investigation. So like, what is it that you're trying to study about your artifact? What is the issue or question you're trying to get to? And then when you've experienced that aha moment, you formulate a propositional argument that highlights the significance of that rhetoric. So the first aha moment could be just like seeing the text and being like, aha, I want to write about that. But then as you're getting into the investigation, and so if you already have a hunch, that might be your aha moment might come at the same time as like you see the text and you have an aha moment about it. Or you might see the text and have some like curiosity about it, and then you start digging and inquiring and discovering, and then you have your aha moment. So it's like if you're the investigator and that crucial piece of evidence that led you to pivot and turn from thinking it was a fidelity thing to being like a secret, an infidelity romance thing, to being like a secret hobby that you have. For example, like what was the aha moment that led for that spark of that interpretation? And then after you have, you know, that aha moment and you've formulated your propositional argument, like basically the theory that's going to probably be your thesis statement, as long as you continue to do your process of discovery, like that thesis still holds water, then everything flows from that moment when you formulate that argument. Like let's say the argument was, okay, it's this secret, you know, the secret philanthropy, right? So then you have to start digging more and highlighting the significance of the evidence that you found, and to, you know, to come to your conclusion. So then you would use that formulation to interrogate the rest of the text. So like, let's say that your hunch was, or your hunch was that, you know, Trump's rhetoric is contributing to the increased political divisiveness or partisan nature of politics in America right now. And then, so that was sort of your initial hunch. And then you get digging into the text, and then you come to a more nuanced understanding as you're looking, you know, further and selecting your artifacts for analysis. And then you come to a conclusion that it's because of his use of a particular technique that you think that his rhetoric is divisive. And so then let's say you have now your theory is that it's this technique that's really driving this. And so then everything flows from that sort of moment when you formulate that argument about the connection between that particular technique and that particular outcome. And then you keep interrogating the text to see if that if that interpretation sort of holds water. And then, you know, sometimes it doesn't hold water, and sometimes you end up having to reformulate and re-theorize in the process of discovery. So this goes back to, it could yield some outcomes that you didn't quite expect. And it also goes back to it being a process that takes time and energy, because while sitting with your artifacts, you might realize that your theory has come to a dead end and you need to modify or write a new theory about your artifacts in order to make your argument work. And so the last sort of message that Medhurst leaves you all with is that these are the main components, or the basic components, of doing rhetorical criticism: thinking, analyzing, interpreting, judging, writing, and rewriting. So if, you know, that's essentially the task that we're honing in on, and the skills that we're honing in on in this class in Com 4190 is being able to think, analyze, interpret, judge, write, and rewrite, and become better rhetorical critics while we're doing that.